Good evening. I'm Alicia Swayze from the journalism department. Thank you for joining me this evening for a conversation with David Barstow of the New York Times. Now, you need to know that his bio...
I'm having some trouble with the connection.
I'm having some trouble with the connection. Okay, sorry. Thought it was muted. Anyway, he has a very long and impressive bio and list of awards. So, David, if it's okay with you, could I maybe give him the Twitter version?
You don't have to give him any version.
Okay. His work has been honored with the Pulitzer Prize 3 times. And that was before his most recent investigative report on the business empire of Donald Trump, which we're going to talk about this evening. But first, please join me in welcoming David to Washington and Lee. Told you it was the Twitter version, so. I remember back during the election when your colleague Sue Craig found a couple pieces of paper in her mailbox, and it turned out it was a couple pages of Trump's tax returns. Can you tell us how you went from that to an investigation that involved 100,000 pages of documents?
Yeah, I remember vividly. I was sitting, that moment is sort of frozen in my mind. I was sitting at my desk. I was actually in the middle of an interview with someone for another story, and Sue Craig came up to my desk and she thrust these pages right in front of my eyes and started waving them at me. And I'm sort of looking at it, I'm talking, and I realized what I was looking at was potentially, a couple of pages of Donald Trump's tax return, and I kind of very rudely hung up from the person who I was in the middle of my interview with, and we looked at these documents, and one number just immediately jumped off the page to me. It was a number that showed that in 1995, he had recorded a loss of $916 million on his income tax return, and it was, but these documents arrived to us anonymously. They just came to us through the mail, and our biggest problem was we had to figure out whether they were real or whether they were being fed to us by someone hoping we would get tripped up on a phony document. And what really made us suspicious was the first 3 numbers of the 916 million were kind of slightly offset from the rest of the numbers. And it made me really worry that somebody might have taken a tax return and then typed in the numbers to make it look like this massive loss. And so our first task was to actually authenticate the document, which happened because the document mentioned who the tax preparer was. I found the guy, he was down in Florida, and I flew down to Florida to see if I could put these documents in front of him. And I remember when we sat down at this bagel shop in right outside of Palm Beach, and I handed him the documents, and I said, we're a little worried about whether or not this is even real, because you see the way the 916 is kind of offset a little bit. And he said, oh, yeah, here's what happened. The software I used, it couldn't handle a number that large. And so I had to type in the numbers myself. And that was when I knew we really were in business. But that document was kind of a moment when we realized that how little we actually knew about Donald Trump's finances. It was this moment that set us a-wondering, if we didn't know this fact about Donald Trump, that he had recorded this ginormous loss in 1995, what else didn't we know? And so we started digging really from that point on. And then the next kind of big point that came was some months later, Rachel Maddow announced on Twitter that she had gotten a hold of Donald Trump's tax returns and was going to be broadcasting about this on her show that night. Well, that was like a Category 5 hurricane for us. We're like, wow, we're going to get scooped, on this. And we were all worried, and we've watched carefully. And it turned out that she had a couple more pages of Donald Trump's 2005 tax return. And that tax return showed that he made $150 million in 2005. And there wasn't much more than that to it. So it was a little bit of a letdown from the point of view of viewers. It was a big moment of relief for me. But still, that document again underscored how little we actually knew about Donald Trump's finances, because as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, he had decided not to follow 40 years of tradition by presidential candidates of releasing tax returns. And so this question of wanting to know and understand what is the story of Donald Trump and money, especially since money is so central to the story of Donald Trump. And that's really the sort of the central thing that pushed us along.
So you're quite familiar with the story that he describes himself as a self-made man, and that he started out with $1 million loan from his father, and he parlayed that into $10 billion. What did your research show?
So we were unable to confirm that account. Over many months of reporting, we were able to pull together over 100,000 pages of documentation and tens of thousands of pages of before now unscrutinized, unpublic financial documents that really describe the inner workings of his father's real estate empire and how that empire intersected with Donald Trump. And this included over 200 tax returns, not of Donald Trump, but of the various Trump family enterprises, trusts, partnerships, and also things like financial audits, financial ledgers. In some cases, we also were able to obtain bank records as well. And what that trove showed, and what we described in the story we produced, is that over a long period of time, from starting when Donald Trump was a toddler, right up really into his 50s, Donald Trump was receiving enormous sums of wealth from his father. We were able to document through these records at least $413 million in direct giving from Fred C. Trump, the real estate developer in New York, and Donald Trump. We were able to document 295 different ways in which Fred Trump funneled money through one way or another to Donald Trump. We were able to discover that when Donald Trump was age 3, he made the equivalent of today of $200,000 a year. He was a millionaire by the time he was age 8. And we were also able to see that the flow of money from Fred Trump to Donald Trump, it actually increased when Donald Trump got himself into financial difficulties, and it increased when Donald Trump was taking on the first, especially the initial projects that really put him on the face of the map as this big-time developer. So we also found, by the way, incidentally, as for the $1 million loan, we actually were able to document that in today's dollars, it actually wasn't $1 million, it was $140 million. And in real dollars, it was $60 million in loans. And we found that in some years, you could see Donald Trump going back to his father month after month after month after month for for more loans. And in many cases, he actually didn't repay the loans. The loans were no interest, had no terms. So in short, the central narrative of Donald Trump's life, that he's a self-made billionaire, what we surfaced in this investigation is really clear, crystal clear evidence from the Trump's own documentation that Donald Trump became wealthy, extremely wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy, thanks to the help that he received from his father, not just when he was 21 years old or in his early 20s, but really right on up through Fred Trump's death and after his death.
Mm-hmm. I got to get on my nieces and nephews because, I've got a couple of 8-year-olds and clearly they're not pulling their weight because, I don't know. Your story states President Trump participated in dubious tax schemes, including instances of outright fraud. Can you explain how you discovered that?
With a lot of patient digging and the help of some really great experts who know tax law inside and out, and some great accounting experts who we consulted, and with a really deep dive. 18 months. There's 3 reporters, myself, Sue Craig, and Russ Buettner, locked ourselves in a room at the New York Times with boxes and boxes and boxes of these documents, and we really combined that with obviously a lot of door knocking to understand as much as we possibly could about the actual inner workings of the Trump real estate empire. Coming to that phrase, outright fraud. I think there were several moments that brought us to that very powerful language. But one of the key moments came when we stumbled across this company with a very unobtrusive sounding name. It was called All County Building Supply and Maintenance. And it was a company that we stumbled across. We didn't really know exactly what it was. And then we found some evidence that it was generating a lot of money. It was paying Donald Trump and his siblings an awful lot of money. And that got us curious. And we started pulling back the layers of what this thing was. And as we described in the story, what emerged after many, many months of pulling out more documents and more documents and more documents was that All County was a sham corporation, simply put, plain and simple. It really didn't exist. Its headquarters was in the basement, basically, of Fred Trump's favorite nephew. It didn't have any employees. It didn't have a corporate headquarters. It didn't even have a sign. But what it did was something very powerful. When Fred Trump went to say, let's say he had all these buildings all over New York, and he had to repair those buildings, and he had to fix them up. And so he had to go buy a lot of stuff, right? He had to buy bleach and mops and new fridges and stoves. And every time he had to buy something, normally for many, many decades, Fred Trump was a very shrewd, disciplined businessman. He drove a hard bargain with his vendors, and his vendors supplied him the stuff and put them in the building. Well, he was so successful that in the early 90s, when Fred Trump was quite old and it was becoming apparent that the end was approaching for him, he was sitting on this huge mountain of cash. You could see it in his bank accounts. We were able to over $50 million in cash sitting in some of the bank accounts that we got access to. And the problem was, how do you get that money out of his bank account and into his children's pockets without paying a 55% gift tax, which was the tax that was then in effect? And the answer was All County Building Supply and Maintenance. So rather than the vendors selling directly to Fred, instead they set up a new system where the vendors would sell to all county, and all county would turn around and bill Fred. So Fred would do a deal for a new boiler for one of his buildings, and instead of the boiler going directly from the vendor to Fred, there would be an extra step added, and there would be an invoice from all county to Fred, only all county would just jack up the price of the invoice on the boiler. If the boiler cost $10,000, the invoice would say it really cost $15,000 or $20,000. And that profit just flowed directly into the owners of All County Building Supply, Donald Trump and his siblings, without that 55% gift tax being applied. So when we discovered that, and we put this in front of, I mean, taxes, the world of taxes, as probably some of you know here, is a very murky world. And finding the line between right and wrong, the line between legal avoidance and illegal evasion, you know, there are really highly paid people in this country. Some of the highest paid lawyers in the country are always pushing that line a little bit further. But when we put the facts of this in front of our experts, every single one of them looked at it and said, oh my goodness, yeah, no, that's fraud, that's illegal, that's wrong. And so that's what helped us get comfortable with saying what we said in the lead of this story. And there are a number of other instances as well, but that one, it had this feel. I said this to some students this morning when we really started pulling back the layers of this little company, this little company in the basement of Fred Trump's favorite nephew. It had the feeling of a kind of a Sopranos episode, you know, where there's a little scam, and it felt like that. And they did. I got to mention this just because it's such a great piece of this. So not only are they sucking money out without paying the tax, but then what they did in New York, in order to raise rents on folks, you know, in rent-regulated buildings, you have to go to the government and get permission. And in order to get permission, you have to show the government the invoices of the work you did on the building in order to get their okay. And they use the invoices to actually calculate to the penny what each of your tenants is going to have to pay extra on their apartment. So rather than sending the real invoice from the boiler guy, instead the Trumps submitted the inflated all-county invoice to the government in order to jack up the rents on thousands of New Yorkers even higher. So they sort of had it coming and going, and it was a great little. That's where you get to outright fraud.
Yeah. When the accountant is shocked, they're hard to shock.
Yeah, they're hard to shock.
Yeah, and Fred's empire was built on using a lot of the federal housing subsidies that were available to him at the time.
Yeah, he was. He's an amazing guy. This guy, Fred Trump, built and sold his first home before he was 20 years old. By the time he was in his mid-30s, he's building hundreds of homes a year. The local papers, they referred to him as the Henry Ford of home construction, because he took some of the techniques of mass production and he actually applied them to building middle-class housing all across Brooklyn and Queens. But what gave that fuel, what really made him an extraordinarily wealthy man, was the housing subsidies, the federal housing subsidies that first took root after the Great Depression and then through World War II, and especially for the returning GIs. The federal government was trying to encourage people to build affordable housing, and so they made available to builders these cheap loans, cheap building loans that were subsidized by the federal government. And Fred Trump became one of the largest recipients of these federal construction loans. And in fact, it's those same federal construction loans that were the source of the money that made Donald Trump earn $200,000 a year when he was 3 years old. And so not only is Fred Trump's wealth very much built on federal housing programs, but actually the wellspring of Donald Trump's wealth comes from exactly the same place.
Mm-hmm. Wasn't he even getting laundry revenues at one point from the buildings?
So Fred, as I mentioned, we were able to document 295 different ways that Fred Trump got money to Donald. And he was endlessly creative in coming up with new ways to get him money. So he would, yeah, of course, he put him on his payroll, but he also paid him to be his consultant. He paid him to be his purchasing agent. He paid him to be his property manager. He gave him laundry revenue. He made him his banker. He made him his landlord. I mean, it was just like on and on and on and on. Fred Trump was constantly thinking up new ways to get money from to his children. And for sure, many of those ways, there's nothing illegal about a bunch of those techniques. They're perfectly legal, absolutely. But we also were able to see that of the $413 million that we were able to document, and a very significant chunk of that was enabled and was enabled by the various tax schemes that we described in this story. It's not just all county building supply, which was a way to suck cash out of Fred Trump's real estate empire, but then there were techniques that they used to transfer the bricks and mortar of the buildings themselves from Fred Trump to his children in ways that also evaded tax law. And the principal technique, I could put you all to sleep in about 10 minutes if I got into the details, but to really simplify it, the basic technique was to take a building that was really a $20 million building and tell the IRS that it's actually $1 million building in transferring that building from one generation to the next. And the Trumps had this down to an art form. They did this over and over and over again with Fred Trump's buildings, transferring them to his children, but transferring them in a way that made it, in the eyes of the IRS, look like what was really a $1 billion real estate empire. By the time you got down to the fine print of the tax returns that we got a hold of, that $1 billion empire was down to $43 million on the tax returns. And what that equates to is, rather than paying a tax bill of over $500 million on the transfer of that real estate, they really paid about 5% of that. They paid about $52 million in wealth transfer taxes. So you can see that the tax schemes combined with the laundry revenue, at some point it turns out to be real money.
Yeah. Sounds like real money. Trump is well known for his name on Atlantic City casinos, and he ran into a lot of financial problems down there. Can you tell us a little bit about how Dad came to the rescue there?
Well, we saw 1990 was really the worst moment in Donald Trump's financial history. The casinos, he had a number of casinos in Atlantic City, and he also made a bunch of other really big purchases in the late 80s, including things like Trump Plaza in Manhattan and Trump Shuttle and a bunch of other big purchases. And he was just drowning in debt. It was in really big trouble. And in 1990, this kind of tells you something. Fred Trump, who could basically, he could pay himself whatever he really wanted to pay himself. And most years he paid himself, in the sort of the $10 to $15 million range. But in 1990, the year when Donald Trump was in huge trouble, Fred Trump suddenly took massive distributions and paid himself $50 million in 1990, just as Donald Trump was really in the, in the tank. And we don't know what happened to all of that money, but we know what happened to some of that money. And in one case, what happened was Fred Trump sent one of his favorite bookkeepers to the casino that Donald Trump owned in Atlantic City. And the casino was in the red. And they had to make a bond payment. They had to make a debt payment. They had to make a $19 million debt payment. And if they didn't make that debt payment, then the casino was going to be in default, and all the horrible things that happened from that were going to take place. Well, Fred Trump sent his bookkeeper to the same casino, and he sent him there with $3.5 million. And the bookkeeper purchased $3.5 million of casino chips, said thank you very much, turned around and left okay, with the casino chips. Didn't place a bet, didn't do anything, just left. And what that did was that temporarily put $3.5 million of liquidity into the casino, and it allowed Donald Trump to make that bond payment, which then allowed him to avoid defaulting. So that was one of the various of the 295 ways. That's one, right? And so Fred Trump, he's an interesting guy in the sense that he could be quite harsh with other family members. He was a real taskmaster. He worked his brains out. He worked 6 days a week, 7 days a week, and he was a taskmaster. And when members of his family disappointed him, he could be quite cruel. But with Donald, he really treated him differently. He was much more accommodating, much more forgiving, and I think as from the reporting that we did, it seems as though at some point early on, he had really identified Donald to be his heir, right? The guy who was going to inherit the dynasty and take it forward. And so he was quite sort of forgiving of Donald and willing to bail him out over and over and over again, except for one moment. And that moment came, again, in this same year of 1990. And again, Donald Trump, as I said, was in terrible shape. And Fred Trump, at this point, had begun to fail. He had begun to show signs of early dementia. He had had some other health problems and surgeries, and he was clearly beginning to fail. And one day, Donald Trump sent to his father 12 pages of very dense legalese that Donald Trump had one of his lawyers draft. And what it was an amendment to Fred Trump's will. And Fred Trump didn't know the lawyer, didn't know that this was being drafted, had never seen this document before, but he starts reading it, and Fred Trump was still with it enough and knew enough about, certainly about wills. He had paid a lot of attention to his will, that as he read through this document, he was like, something's not right here. Something's really off. And so he called his daughter. His daughter is a lawyer and was a federal judge at that point in time. So he called his daughter, Marianne Trump, over to take a look at this document. And they quickly concluded that this document would have allowed, if Fred Trump had signed it, it would have allowed Donald Trump, it would have given Donald Trump complete control over Fred Trump's empire, and potentially, at least in their view, it would have let Donald Trump use Fred Trump's empire as collateral to bail himself out of his own financial difficulties. And that one, when they realized that, when they looked at this and they said, they figured out what Donald Trump was up to, that's the one moment that we see Fred Trump saying, absolutely not one step further. And so what they did was they immediately, in great secrecy, didn't tell Donald Trump they were doing this. They ran out, they got new lawyers, and they rewrote the will so that Donald Trump could not make any decisions on his own without the approval and permission of the other siblings. That's the moment of drama, I suppose, in the family where there was this sort of recognition that this is the one place where Fred Trump was not willing to look the other way with his son.
Not real gratitude there by Junior.
Yeah.
The guy had been pretty generous. You said that the reaction you've received to this story is different than the reaction to some of your other investigations.
Well, I mean, Sarah Sanders held a press conference and said the story was long and boring, so that was a little different. I've been really struck by this. I've been struck by the intensity of the response to the story on both sides. I mean, both sides of the political aisle. There's a a lot of times people will see you, and if they know that you wrote a story, they'll say, "Oh, that was a really good piece. I enjoyed that," or whatever. In this one, here's the best way to describe this. I was on a flight last week out to California, and there was a little kid, a 2-year-old kid, sitting in the seat next to me, and he was squirming around. He was having a hard time with the flight, and his dad was struggling to keep him calm. So I was sort of being a wingman and helping him keep the kid occupied, and so that got me talking to the father. And the father, it turned out, he was on his way out. He was a finance guy from New York, and he asked me what I did. I said, "Well, I'm a reporter from the New York Times." He said, "What kind of work do you do?" I said, "Well, I do investigative reporting." "Well, have you done anything lately?" And I said, "Well, I did this story on Trump and his finances," and the man literally reached across and grabbed me and said, "Thank you so much for doing that." And I keep having this reaction from people literally putting their hands on me and saying, "Thank you, for doing that." I just it's like, thank you. I'm not sure what's in the thank you. There's a thank you, which is partly like, God, we're so relieved that this work can still be done and that it is being done. I mean, that's in there. There's a sort of there's that. There's obviously this sort of this alarm over the time of Trump from people who are on that side. But on the other side, and this doesn't, thank God this doesn't happen in person, but in terms of the what I'm getting from people in emails and in various ways, in voicemails and all the other ways, the response isn't like what you get sometimes from people who are critical of your work, which is like, I think you this was overblown, or this was too long, or why aren't you writing about Hillary Clinton's foundation? There's a level of just fury that we publish this, and it's a fury of, there are tons of death threats, but language which is like, you're a vermin, you're scum, language that was just in its intensity is different from what I've experienced in the past. So I feel like the story was kind of a weird Rorschach test of the moment that we're in right now, and I just haven't experienced that before with other stories that I've written.
Well, it comes at a time where he has for quite some time labeled journalists as the true enemy of the American people. What is your reaction to that?
So, before the bombs were sent to everyone last week, including to CNN, you could see. So, I think a week before that, our security folks at the New York Times were alarmed enough by the communications that have been. I don't know anyone who covers Trump that doesn't get regular death threats at this point. And so at the request of our security staff, the New York City Police put these massive concrete blocks all around our entrances into the New York Times building to try to give us a little additional protection against, I guess, car bombs. We're having, I know that in the Washington Bureau, they've been installing bulletproof glass in places. We're having special training for active shooter situations. And so there are a bunch of these things that had been, that we've been feeling, right? Even before last week's really horrific and tragic events. And so I've said this, that there's a number of things that Donald Trump says repeatedly. He calls us the failing New York Times. That doesn't bother me at all. That's fine. That's okay. We're actually doing great, in part because of him. But anyway, and then he says fake news. That bothers me a little more. But I also think that it's that I actually try to use that. I try to actually, I have that very much in my mind in the way that we wrote this last piece. So in writing this piece, which weighed in at nearly 14,000 words, so it's really the longest investigative article that's ever run off the front page of the New York Times. One of the things that I was very conscious of throughout the writing of that piece was to give readers every possible reason to have faith that what they were reading was not fake. So we made available throughout the story links to the actual documents that we were referring to in the story repeatedly. We showed people as much as possible kind of our math and how we came to the points that we were making throughout the story. You'll find very few references in this story to anonymous sources. We used them very, very sparingly in this, and in part because I think that although the fake news label is offensive to me, because I know of how hard we work to try to get things right. We spent an entire month fact-checking this story. 3 of us in a room that kind of smelled a little bit, to be honest with you, and we spent a month fact-checking every single word of the story. And I can tell you, it doesn't take 18 months to write fake news, right? I can write fake news in 18 seconds. And so that it's offensive, but I also think that it gets at something that's real and that journalists should not ignore, which is that there is an enormous amount of skepticism, some of it well-earned and well-placed, at journalism and at journalistic enterprises. And so I feel like we need to listen to that, and we need to change our journalism to address that, to be more transparent about what's underneath our stories, to be more transparent about our sourcing and where we're getting information from, and to be more transparent about how we arrive, so that people, at least if you got nothing else from this story, at least you didn't come away from the story wondering, is this fake or is this real? I wanted you to at least come away feeling like it was real. So the fake news thing, it bothers me, it offends me, but I also think that it's something that we should use to spur ourselves to do better journalism and more rock-solid, bulletproof journalism. But the enemy of the people thing, that's the one that keeps me up. That's the one that really upsets me the most. Not only because it's so offensive to me personally. I mean, I love this country so much. It's why I do what I do, is because I love this country so much. And it's so offensive to the people who I work with, including, by the way, people like Chris Chivers, who is a reporter, one of my colleagues at the New York Times, who served in the military, served in the Army as an infantry captain. It just is so, so it's personally, I just have to say it personally, it's deeply offensive. But I also see, I can also see in my workplace and around my workplace how it's changing us and making us feel fearful for our own well-being at this particular moment in time. And I think that's terribly dangerous, and it's language that I know our publisher met with Trump in the White House and said to him directly that this isn't just putting our journalists at risk here in this country, but it's also the kind of language and the rhetoric that is also being used in other countries around the world that have far more repressive press laws, and they're using and adopting the exact same language to make it even more dangerous in some parts of the world, to try to be just a simple seeker of truth and a teller of truth. And so that's something that, and I don't, we would have hoped that he would have listened to that and taken that on board. but he clearly has not. He's been doubling down on that in the days since last week's events.
Yeah. And, it basically says that, if you body slam a reporter, that, hey, I'm with you. And we used to only worry about when we sent journalists to the Middle East, but now it's, the Midwest.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, I think there is a ton to criticize in the media, fairly, absolutely fair game, and we don't get things right. I was on the team of reporters at the New York Times who were asked to write about and explain to our readers everything we could about this guy, Jason Blair, who was a former reporter at the New York Times, who we caught making stuff up, literally making stuff up. And that was a painful process that ultimately resulted in the firings of the top editor and the two top editors of the newspaper. And we were brutal in describing all the things that went wrong to produce that journalism. So there's like loads of stuff to criticize, fairly so. It's just like the one thing, the notion that we're the enemy of the people, right? That one is just, to me, is the most toxic and the most harmful of the things that he said.
Yeah. It should be noted that no one has challenged a single number or a single line in the story.
Yeah, well, to be fair, they said the whole thing was false. But no, they have not actually.
But we don't have any specifics. Yeah.
But they haven't actually. No, they have not yet. They have not, at least to this date, they have not taken issue with any of the substance of what we described in the story.
So I'm going to ask you one more question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. Got any more documents in the mailbox? I'm not going to tell you, Alicia. All right. I know David wanted to save some time so all of you could ask questions. So stand up and ask one.
Yes.
Well, thus far, you've done this paper. Has there been any official follow-up? I mean, at this point, okay, nice story, but what happened? Where's it going?
Well, thank you for calling it a nice story. I appreciate that. So here's what's happened and here's what hasn't happened. The New York State tax authorities and the New York City tax authorities immediately announced that they were beginning their own inquiries to see, to look into what we described in the story and to see whether they should take any action. As we said in the story, the events that we described are long past the statute of limitations for criminal charges, so that's unlikely. But there is no statute of limitations for civil fraud, and so potentially, if the city and the state decide that if they're able to confirm the things that we described, that could turn into a really significant financial penalty. The IRS itself has said absolutely nothing in the wake of this story, although they rarely would talk about any individual investigations. A whole series, a long line of Democratic officials immediately said, well, they're going to take this story, and if the Democrats win over either the House or the Senate, they'll use this story as a basis for going after his tax returns. But who the heck knows what's going to happen in a week's time there. And so, so we don't. It's a little bit early days yet to see how this ultimately ripples through the system and whether it's anything more than a nice story. But I'll take that. Yes.
Were the documents leaked to you, or were you able to go after them directly in some way? all the texts?
So there's no, like, your question's a good one and a fair one, and I'm going to leave you disappointed because I'm not going to say very much. But I want to say a couple things, which is, for the students in the class, if there's journalism students, there's a kind of documents that you can't get online, right? They're not readily available, and what it normally takes doing this kind of work is it really requires shoe leather. It requires knocking on a lot of doors and talking to a lot of people and trying to find out, who has access to what. And in this case, you need a lot of luck. You need to create some luck for yourself. And so this was very much a classic shoe leather, a lot of door knocking kind of story. It was not something that we woke up one day and there was 100,000 pages sitting in our mailbox. Yes?
Are Donald's siblings implicated in this civil thing too? I mean, it sounds like there was lots of fraud through this janitorial, whatever the company.
Right.
So even this judge's sister, I mean, are they all implicated in fraud now with this too, sort of?
So the sister, because so in terms of like the all-county building supply and maintenance, I'm sorry, I just love the name so much.
We need to get T-shirts.
Yeah, so there's actually a company in New York called All County Building, or All County. I see their vans around them. For a while we were wondering, could that be the same? No, it's not the same company. Anyway, so the sister is a senior status judge, and so there's potentially some issue there, because she had ownership of this company that I'm describing, and also because she was an executor of her father's estate, and as an executor of her father's estate, she then was responsible for the accuracy of her father's estate tax return. And the father's estate tax return, when you file an estate tax return, you also have to reveal the gifts that were given by the father over the course of his lifetime and submit all the gift tax returns along with the estate tax return. And so you're on the hook for vouching for the accuracy of not just the estate tax return, but all of the gifts that were given over time. And so there's potentially a problem in that the tax return that was submitted, the estate tax return, drastically undervalued and lowballed and didn't mention anything about like All County and the money that flowed to the kids. So there is a potential issue there, but we haven't seen yet any indication that the judicial authorities are looking at her for that. The brother, so Donald Trump has a younger brother, Robert Trump, who's clearly very much in the middle of this because he worked for his brother for many, many years, and then at the time they had came up with a plan for how to make the huge transfer of Fred Trump's wealth to the siblings in the 90s. Robert Trump went to work for his father and was really the kind of the day-to-day guy and had his hands on a lot of the transactions that we actually describe in the story. So he's very much in the thick of it, as is his brother Donald. They had a very, there's a very alpha-beta kind of relationship. Donald was the alpha dog and Robert was the beta dog in that relationship. And so there's definitely questions to be looked at there. And then there's a fourth sister who really didn't have very much to do with the actual business operations. But again, it would come down to a careful analysis of what did she know. So that's a sort of a different issue.
So I'm sort of imagining some scenario where his siblings could turn evidence on him, to save themselves.
We've seen no sign of that yet.
That'd be interesting.
Yes, sir.
At any given time, how many times reporters are not at all dealing with the day-to-day and are sequestered in rooms and working on stories 6 months, year out?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you a little bit about that. So there's an investigative unit, which I'm part of at the New York Times, and that's made up of about a dozen reporters who are tasked specifically with working on these kinds of long projects. And then we also have other clusters of investigative reporters, like in Washington in the business desk, on the sports desk in Metro. So I guess if I had to like ballpark it, I don't know, maybe 20 to 25 of us who are working on these multi-month, long-term investigations. So this is out of a news operation of about I want to say it's about 1,200 people in the newsroom, and so making. I say this all the time, that the single most important thing that I do is in the choices I make of what to pursue. Because when I make a choice to go at something, I'm also making a choice not to go at 75 other things that are probably just as worthy in some way. But it's because there's just not enough of us, and there's too much out there in the world that is desperately in need of reporting, and even more so now, given the collapse of local journalism in this country. And if you think journalism is any better anywhere else in the world, it's not. It's worse. It's substantially worse in huge other chunks of the world. And so the list of like things that really are crying out for serious reporting gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And unfortunately, the pool of people who are being paid to do this work gets smaller and smaller, and that's something that should be hugely alarming to us in this country, because now I remember when I before I went to the New York Times, I worked for the St. Petersburg Times in Florida, and I used to make frequent trips to Tallahassee, and in Tallahassee there was a building where all the reporters from all the state newspapers had offices in this building. It was, 3 stories, 4 stories tall, big building, right? There's probably, 50 or 60 reporters in this building, bird dogging the state legislature of Florida. And I went back there a few years ago, and there was nobody left in that building. It was down to I think 3 reporters, and that to me. I was like, that's terrifying to me, that there are no eyes looking at, this is a big, big, big state government that does lots of important things that affect lots of lives in Florida, and there just aren't the number of eyeballs looking that there used to be even a few years ago. And I will say that the New York Times, if anything, our commitment to investigative reporting has grown significantly. We actually have keep adding investigative reporters, in part because we're recognizing that there's this larger crisis of a decline in serious investigative reporting, and we're trying to at least do something to fill that gap.
So everybody needs to subscribe at least twice. And all you students better be converting to journalism by next week. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Could you explain the mechanics of cataloging, organizing 100,000?
Yeah. Oh boy, you really want to put people to sleep. Okay, so it's a lot of hard work. I said this to a group of students this morning, that in order to pull off this kind of work, you have to be obsessively organized, and you have to commit yourself to reading and absorbing and rereading 100,000 pages of not very scintillating stuff. Tax returns are not like great nighttime reading, and so we have all kinds of systems that we put in place to help us keep track of filing systems, and we built chronologies and spreadsheets. We had spreadsheets for our spreadsheets. We had so many spreadsheets, and we took time throughout the process, to just kind of focus on just that question that you asked, cataloging, organizing, making sure that we knew where everything was, so that by the time we got done with the fact-checking process, we had a fact-checked version of the story that had, I think, over 400 footnotes, right, to specific, we could go right to line 16 of Fred Trump's 1992 tax return in order to see how that number supported what we were saying in this sentence. And so it's an enormous, it's often, investigative reporting is often the most sort of, it requires an enormous amount of patience, a patience to do that kind of almost forensic sort of work. It's like the patience of, I think sometimes, of an archaeologist, just chipping away, knowing that at the end of the day, it's only after you spend all that time on your hands and knees and your back is tired, it's only after doing that for months and months and months that you'll finally sort of see what's revealed. And so a lot of times when I talk about what you need as an investigative reporter, one of the first words that comes to my mind is the word patience.
We can take one more question.
Go ahead, yeah.
You said you were struck by the intensity of the response, but it seemed like when the story came out, it was trending on Twitter for a few hours, and then the Sunday news shows spent a few minutes on it, but the next week, nobody was really talking about it. Does that get frustrating that big stories like this about Trump often get lost in the shuffle?
Yeah, so, this is the time that we live in, right? So a couple of weeks ago, all that the whole world was talking about was Kavanaugh, and we don't talk about Kavanaugh anymore. And then we were talking about Khashoggi, and now we don't talk about Khashoggi anymore because we're all talking about Pittsburgh. And, it's this relentless pace of news that I was, that just constantly is enveloping and swallowing up things that at the time seem like moments of enormous consequence. This story kind of blew up the internet, right, on the day that it was published. It had an enormous, gigantic readership. It was, your stories have sunk into the culture when every single one of the nighttime comedy shows are telling jokes about your story, right? And so it absorbed into the bloodstream of the country really fast, very rapidly, very quickly. But then by the time the Sunday shows were coming around, we published on Tuesday. So Sunday, nowadays, the way the news cycle works, well, that's an eternity, right? That's an eternity. And so that's one of the features of the time that we live in is this sort of exhausting news cycle after news cycle that makes things feel like, wait a minute, like how long ago was Charlottesville? Charlottesville seemed like the biggest thing, and then it was, you'd think we're going to be talking about Charlottesville for months and months and months, and then, after a couple of weeks, it was like swallowed up by something else. It's an amazing time that we live in terms of, living through news events. But I just to really answer your question directly, I don't actually get that hung up in, what the immediate reaction is to the work that I do. I don't actually think about that very much. I don't actually, I find that that's not productive for the work that I do. What I focus on, and what I actually think is the most important thing about the work that I just did with my two colleagues, it's not actually even the substance of it, right? What to me is the most important part of what we did is that the New York Times the most important newspaper in this country, put 14,000 words, published 14,000 very tough words about the most powerful man in the world. And I'm here talking about it with you tonight. I'm not in hiding. I'm not under arrest. I'm sitting here having a nice, pleasant conversation with you. And after this, I'm going to have a wonderful dinner with the president of your university. And to me, that's actually the singular thing that matters about the work that I do. It's the act of publishing. It's the act of exercising the First Amendment. It's the act of holding power accountable and scrutinizing power, in doing so on the front page of a newspaper like the New York Times. That muscle has to be exercised, or you lose that muscle. And to me, there are all kinds of, there's no new stories under the sun, right? There are no new stories under the sun. There'll be other politicians who don't pay their taxes. There will be other politicians who pretend they're self-made billionaires when they're really not. That's not what is, to me, the most important. It's not what makes me go to work every day. What makes me go to work every day is the act of painstakingly, patiently putting together a story like that and then publishing it on the front page of our newspaper, even though I know that it is going to infuriate, right, the most powerful person in the world. That's what I care about, and that's why I do what I do.